The heavy, cloying scent of lilies and hypocrisy hit me the moment I stepped into the cool dimness of St. Michael's, a church my dear departed Richard and I had perhaps unwisely endowed some years ago. Lilies, my least favorite flower, their funereal perfume a suffocating cliché, a scent Richard had always joked reminded him of overly dramatic opera singers. And here they were, great funereal sprays of them, adorning the altar, flanking a ridiculously ornate mahogany coffin, my coffin, apparently, though far too ostentatious for my actual taste. The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated gall, was breathtaking, a perverse masterpiece of filial treachery. It had been Agnes, my oldest friend, my confidant since our school days, bless her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, who had spotted the obituary in the online edition of the Chronicle. Ilara, she'd shrieked down the phone line to my secluded little cottage in Cornwall, where I'd been immersed in a month of blissful, internet-free solitude, finally tackling that sprawling historical novel I'd always dreamed of writing, The Sea Breeze My Muse. You're not going to believe this, but according to the Chronicle, you're dead. Beloved mother and grandmother, Ilara Vance, passed peacefully at her London residence after a brief illness? You were fit as a fiddle, practically tap dancing, when I saw you off on your writer's retreat.
Dead.
My children, Marcus and Chloe, those two polished apples so exquisitely rotten to the core, had declared me dead. For a moment, the world tilted, the cheerful chintz curtains in my rented writing haven blurring into a meaningless, nauseating pattern. The half-finished manuscript on my desk, detailing the triumphs of a forgotten medieval queen, suddenly seemed a foolish indulgence. Then, a cold, hard anger, an emotion I rarely entertained but which now felt like a long-lost, fiercely protective friend, began to crystallize in my veins, sharp and clear as ice. They hadn't even waited for my body to be cold, for a genuine illness to claim me. They'd simply manufactured a convenient demise.
Why?
The answer was as old as time and as ugly as sin: money. My estate, the fruits of a lifetime of hard work with Richard, building our independent publishing house, Vance and Company. Press, from a dusty backroom enterprise into a respected name, was considerable. And they, Marcus with his string of failed startups, and Chloe with her insatiable appetite for designer labels and expensive holidays, had clearly decided to expedite their inheritance. The brief illness was their fiction, my peaceful passing, their passport to my assets, to the legacy Richard and I had bled for, word by painstaking word, book by carefully chosen book. The shock was a physical blow, rendering me breathless, but the betrayal cut deeper, a ragged, festering wound that tore through the carefully constructed peace of my retreat. These were the children I had nurtured, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose first tentative steps into the world I had guided. I had celebrated their small triumphs, mended their larger heartbreaks, always believing, perhaps foolishly, in their inherent goodness. And this was their repayment: to erase me, to nullify my existence, all for the sake of a premature payday. The funeral, Agnes had informed me, her voice a mixture of sputtering outrage and horrified fascination, was today. A rather grand affair by all accounts, she'd sniffed. Your Marcus is giving the eulogy. I imagine it will be a masterpiece of fiction, worthy of your less reputable authors, and so, here I was, not a restless spirit, but a very much alive, very, very angry mother, dressed in a rather fetching charcoal gray suit by a designer Chloe herself coveted, a suit that screamed understated power rather than morning black, ready to attend my own farewell party. My lawyer, Arthur Ainsworth, a man whose calm demeanor belied a mind like a steel trap and an unshakable loyalty to my late husband's memory, was waiting discreetly in a pew near the back, a silent, formidable ally. He'd been apoplectic when I'd called him from Cornwall, his initial disbelief quickly morphing into a cold, professional fury that mirrored my own. The unmitigated effrontery, Ilara, he'd exclaimed. We'll make them rue the day they ever underestimated you. The legal wheels were already in motion, swift and silent. But this public unmasking, this was for me. This was for Richard. This was for the sheer, unadulterated, poetic justice of it all. They thought they were burying Ilara Vance. They were about to discover they had merely awakened a dragon, one with a very long memory and an even longer list of grievances. The slow burn of my life, the quiet dignity with which I had borne my widowhood and their increasing avarice, was about to erupt into a glorious, cleansing inferno, and they, my darling children, were standing squarely, obliviously, in its path. The journey from my Cornish sanctuary back to the smog and duplicity of London had been a blur of cold fury and meticulous, almost gleeful, planning with Arthur. He, bless his pragmatic soul and intricate knowledge of legal loopholes they had undoubtedly tried to exploit, had immediately understood the theatrical and legal necessity of my dramatic appearance. While they're mourning your passing, Ilara, he'd said, a grim, almost predatory smile playing on his usually composed lips, we'll be preparing for your rather spectacular resurrection. They've already filed for probate, the vultures, citing an urgency due to your rapidly deteriorating assets. A blatant lie, of course. The death certificate is a work of art in its own right, a masterpiece of forgery, signed by a Dr. Alastair Finch, a name I vaguely recall from a rather unsavory case involving falsified insurance claims a few years back. Likely a rented signature, easily bought, his words painted an even more vivid picture of calculated, premeditated fraud that made my blood boil with an icy rage. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment folly born of desperation. This was a cold-blooded conspiracy, hatched with a chilling disregard for law, for decency, for the fundamental bonds of family. Marcus, my charming, feckless son, who could talk a bird out of a tree and then sell at a timeshare, but couldn't hold down a serious job to save his life, his history littered with failed startups funded by increasingly reluctant loans from me. And Chloe, my daughter, all brittle smiles and designer labels, whose ambition had always far outweighed her ethics, her social climbing funded by a steady drain on the bank of mum. They had colluded, plotted my demise with the detached efficiency of corporate raiders, and were now, presumably, weeping crocodile tears over my flower-draped, far too expensive coffin. The sheer, theatrical hypocrisy of it was almost magnificent in its awfulness, a dark comedy of errors, their errors. My internal monologue during the drive, punctuated by Arthur's calm, strategic pronouncements, had been a tempest of conflicting emotions. Flashes of memory, unbidden and sharp. Marcus as a boy, his face alight with innocent joy on Christmas morning as he unwrapped a puppy Richard and I had surprised him with. Chloe, a shy, awkward teenager, confiding her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, a dream abandoned for the pursuit of wealthy husbands and social status. Where had those children gone? When had they morphed into these avaricious, soulless strangers? The pain of that loss, the true death of the children I thought I knew, was a raw, aching grief that lay beneath the layers of anger and resolve. But the anger was a more useful emotion, a motivating force, a shield against the despair that threatened to engulf me. It was the anger that would fuel my performance, my righteous retribution. Arthur, with his customary foresight, had arranged for a discreet security detail. 2 burly, plain-clothed men who looked like retired rugby players, just in case my darling offspring, or their equally grasping spouses, decided to react unpredictably. He'd also alerted the local police superintendent, an old acquaintance, to a potential disturbance of a sensitive nature at the church, ensuring a swift response if needed. We were prepared for anything. As I sat in that back pew, the scent of those damned lilies assaulting my nostrils, their funereal sweetness a mockery of life, I watched the mourners file in. Some faces I recognized, their expressions genuinely etched with sorrow. Old friends like Agnes, distant relatives who remembered Richard fondly, former colleagues from Vance and Company. Press. Their grief, so palpable and real, was a stark, painful contrast to the charade being orchestrated at the front of the church by my own flesh and blood. A few, I noted with a grim, internal satisfaction, looked distinctly uncomfortable, their eyes flicking nervously towards Marcus and Chloe, who were a study in performative sorrow, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with ostentatious, black-bordered handkerchiefs. The organ wheezed out a mournful dirge, a tune so relentlessly depressing it was almost comical given the circumstances. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, a wild, inappropriate mirth, and quickly suppressed it. This was not the time for hysterics. This was the time for cold, calculated, glorious revenge. The legal power turns were already in motion, papers filed, injunctions sought. But this appearance, was the emotional power shift, the moment the carefully constructed ground would crumble beneath their feet, revealing the abyss of their own making. The visual metaphor of the empty coffin, soon to be juxtaposed with my very much alive, impeccably dressed presence, was a potent one, a tableau of their ultimate failure. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a fierce, almost joyful anticipation. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of their despicable play, and I, the supposed deceased, was about to deliver the show-stopping, plot-twisting monologue of a lifetime, a performance that would bring down the house, and them with it. The service began, a symphony of fabricated grief, an orchestral masterpiece of hypocrisy. The vicar, a young, earnest man named Father Thomas, whose kind eyes looked thoroughly out of his depth, offered platitudes about my kindness, my generosity, my unwavering faith, and my untimely passing. He'd clearly been fed a carefully curated, entirely fictional narrative by my loving children. I wondered idly if they'd remember to tell him about my lifelong aversion to lilies, or my rather robust and often voiced skepticism regarding organized religion. Likely not. Such details would mar the portrait of sainted motherhood they were so painstakingly painting. Then Chloe, my daughter, a vision in elegant black lace that probably cost more than my entire Cornish retreat, her face a carefully arranged mask of sorrow, strategically placed tears glistening on her lashes, glycerin, I suspected, approached the lectern. Her voice, when she began to speak, was a masterpiece of strained emotion, each word carefully chosen, perfectly modulated to elicit maximum sympathy from the assembled dupes. She spoke of my unwavering support through her many trials usually of her own making, from which I had repeatedly bailed her out, my gentle guidance she had consistently ignored, the gaping void my absence had left in their lives. Gaping void. The only void they were concerned about was the one in their already overdrawn bank accounts, a void they clearly intended my estate to fill with joyous abandon. I listened, my face impassive, a mask of my own, but inside, the dragon was stirring, smoke beginning to curl from its nostrils, its scales hardening. Each lie she uttered, each false sentiment she mouthed, was another log on the pyre of my fury, another reason why this public humiliation was not just deserved, but necessary. She painted a picture of a devoted mother, a doting grandmother to her two children, Thomas and Emily, who were sitting in the front pew looking bewildered and genuinely sad, their small faces pale and confused. My heart ached for them, true innocents caught in their parents' despicable, grasping web. They, at least, would be spared the full financial fallout of my retribution. I had already made provisions for them with Arthur, separate, ironclad trusts far from their parents' greedy hands, ensuring their futures were secure, regardless of the fate of their contemptible parents. Chloe concluded her eulogy with a dramatic, shuddering sob, dabbing at her eyes with that ridiculous handkerchief before returning to her seat, where Marcus patted her hand with a display of brotherly comfort that was truly, stomach-churningly nauseating. Then it was Marcus's turn. My son. He strode to the lectern with a practiced solemnity, his handsome face, so reminiscent of Richard's, yet so devoid of his father's integrity, arranged into an expression of profound, heartfelt sorrow. He was always the better actor of the two, his charm a well-honed weapon. He spoke of my strength, my wisdom, the legacy of love I had left behind, a legacy he was actively trying to steal. He even managed to choke up, his voice cracking convincingly as he recounted a fabricated story of my final, peaceful moments, surrounded by my loving family, whispering words of forgiveness for their many, unspecified, failings. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it, the gall of him standing there, weaving this tapestry of lies over my supposed corpse, almost took my breath away. He was eulogizing a woman who was, at that very moment, sitting a few feet away, listening to every deceitful, self-serving word, her heart hardening into a diamond of resolve, its facets sharp enough to cut glass, or perhaps a fraudulent death certificate. His voice rose to a crescendo, filled with a bogus emotion that would have done credit to a Shakespearean tragedian. And so, we say goodbye to our beloved mother, Alara Vance. May she rest in eternal peace. Eternal peace? I think not. Not while I still had breath in my body and a monumental score to settle. This was my cue. As Marcus turned, his face a mask of tragic nobility, ready to descend from the lectern and accept the condolences of the congregation, I rose slowly, deliberately, from my pew in the shadowed recesses of the church. A few heads turned, curious at the unexpected movement. Then a few more. A ripple of unease, of confusion, began to spread through the congregation, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the air before a thunderstorm. Arthur, ever vigilant, gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod.
Showtime.
The dragon was about to make her entrance. I took a deep breath, the heavy, cloying scent of lilies and lies thick in my throat, a suffocating miasma I was about to dispel, and began to walk down the central aisle. My heels, modest but firm, clicked softly on the ancient stone floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly hushed, expectant church. Heads were turning now, en masse, a wave of bewildered faces rippling through the pews. Whispers erupted, like dry leaves skittering across a graveyard, furtive and shocked. Is that? It can't be. Alara? Alara Vance. I saw Agnes's face, her eyes wide as saucers, her mouth agape, a mixture of utter shock and dawning, incredulous delight spreading across her wonderfully expressive features. I gave her the faintest of smiles, a silent acknowledgement of our shared outrage and impending triumph. Marcus, halfway back to his seat, had stopped, frozen mid-stride, his back still to me, oblivious for a precious few seconds more to the cataclysm about to engulf him. Chloe, however, ever more attuned to shifts in social atmosphere, had turned at the sound of the rising whispers, her perfectly made-up face slackening, her eyes widening and dawning, horrified disbelief. Her mascara, I noted with a certain grim satisfaction, was about to be truly, irrevocably tested. As I reached the front of the church, a few feet from the ridiculously ornate, lily-draped coffin they had chosen for me, a monstrously expensive piece of funereal frippery I would have abhorred, Marcus finally turned, drawn by the collective gasp that seemed to suck the air from the church. His carefully constructed mask of grief shattered into a million pieces, like fragile porcelain dropped from a great height. His jaw dropped, quite literally. His face, moments before a study in sorrowful dignity, was now a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes bulging with a terror that was immensely, profoundly gratifying to behold. "Mum," he croaked, his voice a strangled, unrecognizable whisper, the sound barely audible above the sudden, deafening silence. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be
dead,"
I supplied, my voice clear, resonant, carrying easily through the stunned silence of the church, each syllable imbued with an icy composure I hadn't known I possessed. I allowed myself a small, cold smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but speaks volumes of retribution. Yes, well, as you can see, Marcus, reports of my demise have been, shall we say, greatly exaggerated. Though I must commend your commitment to the role, a collective gasp, louder this time, rippled through the congregation. The vicar, Father Thomas, looked as if he might faint, his hand fluttering to his chest. Chloe had sunk back into her pew, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting wildly between me, vibrant and very much alive, and the polished mahogany coffin, as if trying to reconcile two utterly impossible, contradictory realities. I must say, Marcus, Chloe, I continued, my gaze sweeping over my two treacherous offspring, pinning them like insects under a microscope. You've thrown quite the farewell party. Lovely lilies. Though you both know perfectly well I always preferred roses. Such a curious oversight. Given your supposed grief, my sharp comeback, delivered with a calm that belied the inferno raging within me, a carefully controlled burn, seemed to break the spell. A babble of voices erupted, shock, confusion, outrage, and perhaps, from some quarters, a dawning, horrified amusement. But the death certificate? Marcus stammered, his eyes flicking desperately towards Miss Carmichael, his lawyer, a sleek, predatory woman who now looked as though she'd swallowed a particularly unpleasant toad. Yes, the death certificate, I said, my voice hardening, the velvet glove slipping to reveal the iron fist. A rather creative piece of fiction, wouldn't you agree? Signed by the esteemed Dr. Alastair Finch, a man of flexible ethics, I understand. I believe my lawyer, Mr. Arthur Ainsworth, who is present today. I gestured towards Arthur, who rose briefly from his pew, a silent, formidable presence radiating legal authority, has a few pertinent questions for Dr. Finch. And for you both. As I imagine, do the police, who are waiting rather patiently outside, having been alerted to a potential irregularity. The word police had a wonderfully clarifying, sobering effect. Chloe let out a small, strangled squeak, a sound like a mouse caught in a trap. Marcus swayed on his feet, looking as if he might collapse onto the cold stone floor. The dramatic reveal was complete. The power shift was absolute, a seismic upheaval in their carefully constructed world of lies. I had turned their carefully orchestrated tragedy into a farce, with them as the humiliated, exposed clowns in a circus of their own making. The fierce, emotional stakes had culminated in this moment of public unmasking, their betrayal laid bare for all to see, their greed exposed in all its naked ugliness. The triumphant feeling was intoxicating, a heady cocktail of vindication and righteous fury, a feeling I intended to savor. So, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously soft, almost intimate tone that nevertheless carried to every corner of the church. Perhaps you'd like to continue with your eulogy? Or shall we move on to the probate proceedings? I understand you've been rather proactive on that front. We wouldn't want to keep your creditors waiting, would we? The ensuing chaos was everything I could have hoped for, and more, a beautiful, satisfying implosion of their carefully laid plans. Chloe, true to form, promptly burst into hysterical, and this time undoubtedly genuine, tears, her carefully constructed composure dissolving into a blubbering, mascara-streaked mess. Her sobs were not those of grief, but of a child caught red-handed, her expensive Italian handbag slipping from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone. Marcus, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, abject terror, simply stood frozen, his eyes darting between me, the ludicrously empty coffin, and the stern, unyielding presence of Arthur Ainsworth, who had now moved with quiet dignity to stand beside me, a silent sentinel of justice. The vicar, Father Thomas, bless his cotton socks and his well-meaning but utterly overwhelmed nature, was attempting to restore order, his reedy voice pleading for calm, for Christian charity, his words lost in the rising cacophony of shocked whispers, indignant exclamations, and the occasional, quickly suppressed chuckle from those less invested in the solemnity of the occasion. Agnes, I saw through the throng, was beaming, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of triumph and "I told you so" righteousness. She caught my eye and gave me a discreet, yet utterly enthusiastic, thumbs up. The police, as promised, made their entrance then, 2 uniformed officers stepping quietly but firmly into the church, their presence radiating an aura of calm, no-nonsense authority. Their arrival had an immediate, sobering effect. The babble died down, replaced by an expectant, almost breathless silence, the kind that precedes a particularly dramatic pronouncement. Arthur stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the lingering confusion like a well-honed blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the stunned congregation before settling, with pointed significance, on Marcus and Chloe. "I am Arthur Ainsworth, legal counsel for Mrs. Alara Vance. As you have just witnessed, Mrs. Vance is very much alive and, I might add, in remarkably robust health." A few more gasps, a rustle of clothing as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "It appears a grievous error, or perhaps something far more deliberate and criminally culpable, has occurred regarding the notification of her alleged passing and the subsequent, and I must emphasize, fraudulent, filing for probate of her estate." He paused, letting his carefully chosen words sink in, his gaze unwavering as it locked onto Marcus and Chloe, who now looked like cornered animals, their eyes wide with panic. "The relevant authorities, including the Serious Fraud Office, have been notified, and a full investigation into the procurement of the fraudulent death certificate and the premature, illegal attempts to access Mrs. Vance's assets is underway." The legal power turn was complete, delivered with devastating precision and a chilling lack of emotion. "The fraudulent death certificate, the premature, illegal attempts to access assets." Each phrase was a hammer blow to my children's already shattered credibility, a public branding of their perfidy. Ms. Carmichael, Marcus and Chloe's lawyer, a woman whose shark-like smile had vanished entirely, was attempting to engage Arthur in a hushed, frantic sidebar, no doubt trying to salvage some sliver of dignity for her clients, or perhaps just for herself. But he simply ignored her, his focus entirely on setting the record straight for all to hear. The emotional symbolism of my standing there, vibrant and very much alive, an embodiment of inconvenient truth, beside my own ostentatiously empty coffin, was a tableau of ultimate poetic justice they would never live down. They had tried to bury me, to silence me, to erase me from the ledger of the living. Instead, I had risen, quite literally, to confront them in the very forum they had chosen for their deceitful, self-congratulatory performance. The on-screen text, as it were, of their guilt was writ large on their terrified, crumbling faces. "As for this service," I said, my voice laced with an irony so dry it could parch deserts, my gaze lingering on the offensive lilies, "I believe it can be considered concluded. Though perhaps, Marcus, Chloe, you might want to have a word with the funeral director about a refund for the coffin. It seems it will no longer be required. Unless, of course," I added, a faint, chilling smile playing on my lips, "you'd like to reserve it for future use yourselves?" Though I doubt my estate will be covering that particular expense, my sharp comeback, delivered with icy composure and a hint of theatrical flair, elicited a few stifled gasps and, I thought I detected, a few quickly suppressed snorts of dark amusement from the back pews. The fierce, triumphant feeling surged through me, not of joy, for there was little joy to be found in the utter moral bankruptcy of one's own children, but of a grim, hard-won, and deeply satisfying vindication. The battle was far from over, but this first, crucial engagement had been an unequivocal, spectacular victory. The dragon had not only awakened, it had breathed fire, and my deceitful, grasping offspring were well and truly scorched, their reputations and soon their freedom reduced to ashes. The immediate aftermath in the church narthex, and spilling out onto the sun-dappled steps of St. Michael's, was a scene of barely controlled pandemonium, a chaotic tableau that felt miles removed from the somber charade of moments before. Marcus and Chloe were being spoken to, in hushed but firm tones that brooked no argument, by the police officers, their faces pale and stricken, their expensive funereal attire suddenly looking like ill-fitting costumes on disgraced actors. Ms. Carmichael, their lawyer, hovered nearby, her expression a tight mask of fury and professional damage control, no doubt already calculating the astronomical legal fees this debacle would incur, and the slim chances of ever collecting them. Many of the mourners, their initial shock giving way to a mixture of righteous outrage on my behalf and a sort of horrified, almost gleeful fascination, were attempting to approach me, to offer words of support, commiseration, or perhaps just to get a closer look at the woman who had gate-crashed her own funeral with such spectacular aplomb. Their faces were a gallery of emotions: disbelief, sympathy, a touch of awe. Arthur, ever the stalwart guardian, managed them with polite but firm efficiency, his quiet gravitas creating a small, protective bubble around me, shielding me from the worst of the well-intentioned, if somewhat overwhelming, crush. Agnes, however, a force of nature in her own right, broke through the informal cordon, her face alight with a fierce, proprietary joy. "Ilara, you magnificent, audacious woman," she exclaimed, her voice ringing with approval as she pulled me into a fierce, surprisingly strong hug. "I knew you wouldn't take this lying down. Or, well, you know what I mean. Those wretched children. I always said they had champagne tastes and lemonade incomes." Her genuine delight, her unwavering, uncomplicated loyalty, was a balm to my bruised soul, a reminder that true friendship endured even when familial bonds had rotted away. We made our way out of the church, leaving behind the cloying scent of lilies, the bewildered, stammering vicar, who I later sent a generous donation to, along with a sincere apology for the disruption to his Sunday service, and the rapidly imploding lives of my son and daughter. The fresh air outside, carrying the mundane sounds of city traffic and distant sirens, felt like a liberation, washing away the stale atmosphere of deceit and cloying hypocrisy. The investigation, Arthur assured me in low tones as we settled into the plush leather seats of his waiting car, would be thorough and unsparing. Forgery of a legal document, conspiracy to defraud, perjury. The charges they could potentially face were serious, carrying significant custodial sentences. Their desperate attempt to fast-track probate, to get their greedy, grasping hands on my assets, had now become Exhibit A in the rapidly growing case against them. The dramatic power shift was not just emotional, it was legal, tangible, irreversible. They had held all the cards, or so they had arrogantly thought, believing me to be isolated, frail, and conveniently out of the way. Now, their hand was revealed to be nothing but a collection of jokers, their bluff called in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The internal monologue that had raged with such fury for days was now quieting, replaced by a weary but resolute calm. The fight had been won, this crucial battle at least, but the cost, the brutal, undeniable realization of my children's profound, calculated betrayal, was a wound that would take a long time to heal, if ever. As the car pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of Marcus and Chloe, still deep in conversation with the police, their expensive funeral attire looking incongruous and absurd in the harsh, unforgiving light of day. They looked small, diminished, stripped of their arrogant entitlement. There was no pity in my heart for them, not a shred, only a cold, hard certainty that they were reaping what they had so despicably, so short-sightedly sown. The roses, I thought, the ones Richard and I had planted at our old Hampstead home, the ones I truly loved, with their honest thorns and vibrant, life-affirming blooms, would be a far more fitting tribute to a life well lived than those offensively funereal lilies. Perhaps I would visit them soon. The common devices of this family tragedy, the betraying family members, the resilient protagonist, the loyal legal ally, had played out their roles with dramatic flair. Now came the denouement, the slow, meticulous process of reclaiming my life, my assets, my peace, and ensuring that justice, in all its multifaceted forms, was served, cold and satisfying. The sentence style of their future looked bleak and confined. Mine, however, was suddenly, unexpectedly, gloriously full of possibilities once more. The legal battle that followed was, as Arthur had predicted, complex and drawn out, but ultimately decisive in its outcome. The evidence against Marcus and Chloe, meticulously compiled by Arthur's team and the police, was overwhelming, a mountain of deceit that even their high-priced lawyers couldn't dismantle. The fraudulent death certificate, procured through the less-than-scrupulous Dr. Alastair Finch, who, facing his own ruin, quickly turned state's evidence in exchange for a lesser charge, his testimony painting a damning picture of my children's cold-blooded instructions, was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. Their premature probate filings, their brazen attempts to liquidate assets even before my ashes were supposedly cold, including trying to sell a beloved Lowry painting Richard had gifted me, painted a clear, irrefutable picture of premeditated greed and a chilling lack of conscience. Sarah Jenkins, a forensic accountant Arthur brought onto the team, a woman with eyes like a hawk and a mind like a supercomputer, meticulously traced the labyrinthine web of debts Marcus and Chloe had accumulated, revealing a desperate financial situation that had clearly driven them to such an extreme and despicable act. Their lifestyles of lavish holidays, designer wardrobes, and failed vanity businesses had far outstripped any legitimate income, leaving them teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. My estate was their only lifeline, and they had been determined to seize it by any means necessary. Their defense, mounted by a flustered and increasingly beleaguered Miss Carmichael, who, I later learned, had significant trouble getting her fees paid, crumbled under the weight of the facts. They tried to argue diminished responsibility, citing the stress of their financial woes. They hinted at temporary insanity, a desperate plea that held no water. They even had the unmitigated gall to suggest, through their lawyer, that I had somehow driven them to it with my eccentricities, my reclusiveness since Richard's death, and my refusal to provide adequate financial support for their increasingly unsustainable and extravagant lifestyles. The sheer audacity of this victim-blaming, after they had literally tried to bury me, was almost impressive in its shamelessness, and it did not sit well with Judge Honoria Davies. I, of course, attended every court session, a silent, implacable presence in my customary charcoal gray, a constant visual reminder of their perfidy. My testimony, when it came, was delivered with the same calm, unwavering clarity I had displayed at my funeral. I recounted the discovery of their plot, the initial shock, the profound betrayal, but also my unshakable determination not to be erased, not to allow Richard's legacy and mine to be squandered by their greed. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness but little patience for fools or fraudsters, listened intently, her gaze often flicking towards Marcus and Chloe, who seemed to shrink a little further into their expensive, ill-fitting seats with each passing day. The courtroom drama lacked the immediate, theatrical impact of my funeral appearance, but it was a crucial part of the slow-burn justice I sought, a methodical, legal dismantling of their lives. This was where the legal power turns, initiated by Arthur, would be solidified into irreversible, life-altering consequences. The emotional symbolism of my continued, vibrant presence in that courtroom, day after day, a living testament to their failed conspiracy, was not lost on anyone, least of all the jury. I was the ghost at their legal feast, and my presence clearly spoiled their appetite for further deceit. The dry, poetic justice continued to unfold with satisfying precision. They had wanted my money so badly they were willing to declare me dead. Now they were spending what little they had left, mostly borrowed, I suspected, on lawyers, desperately trying to avoid prison, their reputations in tatters, their social standing annihilated, their names a byword for filial treachery. The inheritance they had so eagerly, so callously, anticipated was now a distant, impossible dream, evaporating like mist in the harsh sunlight of truth. My will, needless to say, was being comprehensively, and rather gleefully, rewritten by Arthur. Provisions for Thomas and Emily, my innocent grandchildren, would be sacrosanct, placed in unbreakable, carefully managed trusts far from their parents' grasping, irresponsible hands. But Marcus and Chloe? They would not see another penny from me, not in this life, nor, if I had any say in it, in the next. The verdict, when it came after a surprisingly short deliberation, was quiet but absolute. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and forgery. The sentences were significant, several years each, though perhaps not as long as I, in my less charitable moments, might have wished. But their lives, as they knew them, the lives of pampered privilege and casual deceit, were over. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter of profound pain and betrayal finally closed. The process of reclaiming my life, both legally and emotionally, was a gradual one, like tending a long-neglected garden, weeding out the choking vines of deceit and nurturing the fragile shoots of a new beginning. Arthur Ainsworth and his exemplary team worked diligently, with quiet efficiency, to untangle the legal and financial mess Marcus and Chloe had created in their frantic, premature grab for my assets. Probate was formally halted, their fraudulent claims dismissed with damning judicial commentary. Any assets they had managed to illicitly touch, a few smaller accounts they'd tried to drain, some shares they'd attempted to offload, were clawed back with interest and penalties. My financial affairs, which had always been robust thanks to Richard's acumen and my own careful stewardship of Vance and Company Press, were once again securely under my own control. The locks metaphorically and literally changed. The cottage by the sea in Cornwall, once a temporary writer's retreat, became my permanent sanctuary, a haven of windswept beauty and blessed solitude. The scent of salt and roses, the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs, the plaintive cry of the gulls, these were the honest, uncomplicated companions of my days. I found a quiet, profound satisfaction in simple routines, tending my small but flourishing garden, taking long, bracing walks on the deserted beach with Agnes's boisterous golden retriever, whom I often borrowed, and, of course, returning to my historical novel, its medieval queen now seeming a kindred spirit in her resilience and determination. Agnes visited often, her sharp wit and unwavering loyalty a constant comfort, a reminder that not all human connections were fraught with betrayal. We would sit on my small, sun-drenched veranda, sipping Earl Grey tea, or sometimes a G&T, if the day had been particularly trying or particularly triumphant, watching the tide ebb and flow, and sometimes we would even laugh, truly laugh, about the absurdity of it all, the funeral, the lilies, the sheer, unmitigated gall of my children. The laughter was healing, a sign that the fierce, vengeful Alara who had confronted her mourners was slowly giving way to a more serene, if eternally warier, version of herself. The emotional tone of my life began to shift, subtly but perceptibly, from the fierce and triumphant to something quieter, more reflective, like the sea after a storm. The betrayal had left scars, of course, deep and indelible. The relationship with Marcus and Chloe was irrevocably broken. There would be no reconciliation, no deathbed forgiveness sought or offered. They had made their choices of such profound moral turpitude, and now they were living with the stark, unyielding consequences. I felt a profound sadness for the children they had been, for the bright promise they had squandered, for the family we had once been, however flawed. But that grief was for a past that no longer existed, for people who had effectively ceased to be. My focus was on the present, on rebuilding not just my finances, but my spirit, on finding a measure of peace in the wreckage. The empowering feeling came not from their downfall, though there was a certain grim satisfaction in that, but from my own survival, my own resilience. I had faced the ultimate betrayal, a plot worthy of a sensation novel, and had not only endured but had emerged stronger, more fiercely protective of my own autonomy and well-being than ever before. The language style of my internal monologue softened, the sharp, cutting edges smoothed by time and distance. The sharp comebacks were no longer needed. My courtroom battles were won. The strategic planning was complete, the enemy vanquished. Now, there was space for quieter thoughts, for introspection, for a tentative, hopeful exploration of what this unexpected new chapter of my life might hold. I began to volunteer at the local village library, sharing my lifelong love of books with children whose eyes still shone with innocent enthusiasm, finding a simple, uncomplicated joy in their eager questions and unbritished imaginations. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, a way of investing in a future generation, a quiet counterpoint to the bitter, profound disappointment of my own. The roses in my Cornish garden, cuttings taken years ago from the robust, fragrant bushes at my old family home in Hampstead, bushes Richard and I had planted together, began to thrive in the salty air, their blooms a vibrant, defiant testament to endurance and renewal. They were a daily reminder that even after the harshest, most brutal pruning, life could, and would, find a way to flourish anew, stronger, and more beautiful for the trials endured. The final pieces of the legal puzzle clicked into place with a quiet, satisfying finality. Marcus and Chloe began their prison sentences, their desperate appeals exhausted, their futures looking as bleak and confined as the gray walls that now enclosed them. Dr. Alastair Finch, his medical license permanently revoked, his reputation in tatters, faded into the ignominy he so richly deserved, a cautionary tale for professionals tempted by easy, unethical money. The newspapers, after a brief, breathless flurry of sensational headlines, "Woman attends own funeral. Declares, I'm not dead yet. Death fraud children jailed after mother's shocking resurrection," eventually moved on to other scandals, other dramas, their insatiable appetite for sensation temporarily sated. My life, too, found its new, quieter rhythm, far from the glare of unwelcome publicity. The fierce, vengeful fire that had fueled my dramatic return from the dead had burned itself out, leaving behind not ashes and desolation, but a landscape strangely cleared, fertile for new growth. The triumph was no longer a burning, immediate sensation, but a deep, settled conviction in my own strength and the ultimate, if sometimes frustratingly delayed, workings of justice. I occasionally heard snippets of news about Thomas and Emily, my grandchildren, through Agnes, who had a network of well-meaning contacts that would rival any intelligence agency. They were being cared for by Chloe's sister-in-law, a sensible, kind woman whom I had always liked, and were, by all accounts, doing as well as could be expected under such traumatic circumstances. The substantial trusts I had established for them, managed by Arthur with scrupulous diligence, would ensure their education, their well-being, and a secure start in life, free from the destructive taint of their parents' greed and irresponsibility. That, at least, was a profound comfort, a small measure of good salvaged from the wreckage. My relationship with them would be complicated, perhaps even impossible for many years to come, the poison of their parents' actions inevitably seeping into their perceptions. But I had done what I could to protect their futures, and I held on to a sliver of hope that one day, when they were old enough to understand the full, unvarnished truth, they might seek me out. The point of view from which I now surveyed my life was one of careful, considered peace, earned through fire and fury. I had faced the abyss of familial betrayal, stared into its cold, grasping depths, and had walked away, not unscathed, for such wounds never fully heal, but whole, my spirit intact. The audience addressing style of my internal narrative was now simply a quiet conversation with myself, a woman who had learned the hardest, most bitter lessons about love, betrayal, and the astonishing, often underestimated, resilience of the human spirit. The general style tags that had defined this extraordinary, tumultuous chapter of my existence: elder revenge drama, family betrayal, legal empowerment, slow burn justice, were now receding into the past, becoming part of a larger, more complex, and ultimately more peaceful life story. I was no longer just the woman who had crashed her own funeral, a figure of fleeting, sensational notoriety. I was Alara Vance, survivor, writer, gardener, lover of books, and a woman who, against all odds, had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. The empty chair at the metaphorical table of my family was a stark, painful reminder of what had been lost, of the children who had chosen greed over love. But the table itself, the one in my sunlit Cornish kitchen, was now set for one, in a small cottage by the sea, surrounded by roses, good books, true friends, and the enduring power of a life well lived, fiercely defended, and unapologetically on her own terms. The final, lasting victory was not in their punishment, however deserved, but in my peace, in the quiet, unwavering beat of my own, very much alive, and now, finally, content heart.